Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeffrey and I'll be your host. This is part two to our historical musicals podcast. And again, I have Ingrid Sorensen with me for this podcast. Our last podcast, we discussed and critiqued 1776. So if you missed the first part, go back and check that out. And today we're actually going to be talking about Bloody Andrew Jackson. And as I stated in the previous podcast, that this details the life of President Andrew Jackson. So I'm just going to give you all a brief background of what the musical talks about, and then we'll dive into the professional critiques and our own critiques of it. So the obviously details the life of President Jackson, his early life and his family dying, and then we get part of his War of 1812 campaigns, his Native American campaigns against Florida and the Seminoles. And then we go into the political battles with the Democratic Republicans. And then the last part of the musical talks about his presidential campaigns and his two-term presidency. We're going to go into our professional critiques. This first one is from the MD Theater Guide, and it states that Bloodies look at the life of a complicated, flawed man and his tarnished legacy through comedy and rock is a mixed bag, so be ready to be taken somewhere. So they kind of had overall a mixed view of Bloody Andrew Jackson, and their full critique that they sometimes say that the rock music doesn't always work with the musical, but they still say that it's an interesting take on his life. Our second critique is from the New York Times, and they stated, Bloody manages to be a goofy delight and a perversely affecting comment on the American temperament at the same time. And though he looks absolutely nothing like Barack Obama, George W. Bush, or Sarah Palin, you'll catch unsettling glimpses of all of those famous faces in Mr. Walker's own Bloody. So I'm going to ask you a question, Ingrid. Do you agree that Jackson is similar to Obama, Bush, and Palin?
Okay, so I have some questions for you, but I will wait for later. So I will have this is my caveat. So most of my historical knowledge tends to be colonial history. So I probably will do better on stuff like 1776 or Hamilton. However, that being said, from my understanding of Jackson, I do think Jackson's kind of like on his own level. I don't think Obama, Bush, or Palin come close to him at all. Indigenous genocide is a pretty bad thing. But besides that, of the three, I guess I'd say Jackson and Palin are more comparable, I guess due to their political preference for populism.
I can't even compare him to those three.
And then I guess some questions. Honestly, I would name a more contemporary politician. I just don't know if we want to go there.
Yeah, I understand that. But even some of the other 20th century presidents may be closer than Bush, Palin, or Obama. I mean, that's to me, that's a stretch, but it's not my critique, it's theirs.
Yeah, I guess so. I have a couple of questions for you then as a rebuttal. So firstly, do you see, I guess you agree with my assessment, or do you see him being more comparable to Obama, Bush, and or Palin at all?
I can't even see him at any one of those. I mean, Palin's okay, I guess, as a comparison, but even she does not go as far as he does with trying to get a popular vote. I mean, he went to great lengths to please the people. And to me, that backfired on him. While Barack Obama had a populist feeling because he was the first Black president, so I would consider a lot of Black voters would probably vote for him just so they could have someone of their own race as their president. So he could maybe be considered close to that, but even then, I think Jackson still goes further. And I think the people were more tired of the Democratic Republicans than they were of George W. Bush and the Republican Party. So I think there's a big diversity there.
Yeah, I guess if the point is to say, at the end of the day, all politicians, regardless of party, share commonalities or similarities. I'm sorry. I guess I could kind of see that, but I think, as we had both kind of said, Jackson was just so extreme in so many things. I feel like if you're kind of a mainstream politician, well, there might be some overlap, but I just don't really see a ton of it. And then I know you have some more questions lined up, but two more I'd like you to consider are: number one, are you an AC/DC fan? Because they totally made a reference to that in the musical. And then two, on a more serious note and jokes aside, did you have like a favorite moment or a song from the musical? So you don't have to answer those now, just something to think about down the way.
I can answer the AC/DC one now. Yes, I do like AC/DC. Also, one thing that drew me to this musical is that it did take a punk rock feeling. So I'm a product of my
Mm-hmm.
time. I'm a millennial at heart, so I grew up in that punk rock, grunge, and kind of the boy band age of punk rock, where I have an affection for this musical because they take that to an extra level and they add historical leanings to it. So that just drives me crazy. So I just love it when it has that feeling because as much as I like the Rogers and Hammerstein type feel of like 1776, I do like the more modern esque musicals where they give way to R and B rap and more of a rock feel.
Mm-hmm.
Favorite song? Oh man.
Or a moment, maybe not. So, because there's not a ton of singing.
Yeah.
Like 1776, there isn't a ton of singing in Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, but I wasn't sure if there's a particular scene or lyric or, like I said, song that stuck out as like, oh, that's brilliant, or something like
I'm
those
a
lines.
fan of his battles with the Democratic Republicans because it shows how much the people were tired of the same party.
Mm-hmm.
Since Jefferson was elected, the Democratic Republicans had been in power until Jackson. So I like how they try and shun him out because he's different. He's of a different status. And it shows how the country was trying to finally turn towards more of a working class instead of the elitist class that we had in the early part of the 19th century. So I
Mm-hmm.
liked those battles in the musical slash play.
Awesome.
All right. Any other questions before we go into our critiques?
No, you go. That's all
All
you now, bud.
all right. So my critique of this musical is I see it more like the country wants a more flashy and sweet talker. Our attention turns very fast from one party to the next. And it seems to never want the same thing for more than a few years. And when Jackson entered into politics, the Democratic Republicans held office from 1800 to 1828. And that's a long time for one party to have control of the White House. Most of the presidents seemed from the elitist class and not for the people. And Jackson easily gained that populist point of view after the four previous presidents. So I think that this musical definitely shows how the people never want anything for that long, and they start to get uh, I don't have a word. They long for something different, and Jackson was definitely something different. And he
Mm-hmm.
was a military vet, and other parties in the future tried to mimic having someone as a military leader go into politics, and it seems to work off of a Jackson's kind of platform because we'll see that Harrison gets elected because he was in a military man. Grant does the same thing. So it just seems that his platform works when there needs to be a new point of view. And I think that this musical really shows how he really led the people to believe that he was something different. To his fault, he listened to the people because he didn't always know what he wanted, and the people don't always know what they want, or they change their mind, which shows in the latter half of the musical when he starts to turn on everyone and himself. So that's my take. What is yours?
Yeah, so to your point, how does the musical portray America? You make lots of great points. And unfortunately, I feel lame kind of following, but as we were saying before in the previous podcast, politics during, or even in this one, politics during our lifetime have certainly been interesting, especially as of late. As you mentioned, elitism. It seems that for some people there might be disconnect between our politicians and the public, and this is also a point that is mentioned in 1776, as well, in the song Cool, Cool, Considerate Men. As you'd mentioned, these really powerful, wealthy white men held power, right? So I think the musical also reminds America of its bloody, no pun intended, history, and the continuation of those choices throughout its history. This musical uses a lot of vivid imagery, such as, white shirts that are soaked in blood, cutting imagery, right? It contains a lot of violent references, such as slavery, and a distaste for groups of others that include, as you had mentioned previously, Native Americans, Spaniards, and the British, which I think is a theme we can see throughout American history. It might not necessarily be those groups per se, but different groups that have become or achieved other status. And I think that even is relevant into contemporary times that we live in.
That's a great point there, because the imagery in this musical is super vivid. From the beginning, essentially, he has blood on his shirt, and they don't take that blood off of his shirt. So to me, that always shows that he has some type of bloodiness on his hands, whether it's from his wartime, his genocide time, his family dying. He's just always had a bloody path to where he ended up. I think that imagery that people may not catch on to right away if they don't know much about Jackson, I thought that was one of the cool ways that the art really helped try and show Jackson's true.
Yeah, it definitely enhanced it for sure.
All right. So one thing that I wanted to talk about is some things that we like to see added or removed from this musical. I would have liked to have more of a political side of Jackson. We get the moments of his battles with the sitting presidents and the Native American removal policies, but there are a lot of extra politics that we missed out on. His battles with Crockett would have been a good add-on to this musical because they fought in the War of 1812, and during the Red Sticks campaign, Crockett left, and we get nothing of that from this musical. I'd also like to see some aftermath of his choices as president. Van Buren had to deal with all of Jackson's choices as president, and it definitely hindered his presidency and political sway. I think that's why he was only a one-term president, because Jackson's policies really had an effect on late presidencies. Do you have anything that you would like to see added or taken out of the musical?
Sure. So quick point. So when you say Crockett, you mean like Davy Crockett, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Kind of figured I was like the one with the coon's cap, right? But all right. So anyways, so yeah, there were some things that it is rather a short musical, especially compared to something like 1776. So there were three things I kind of wish that they had delved into a little more deeply. Firstly, I kind of wish they had further developed the relationship between Andrew and Rachel. He was very protective of her, and I feel as if the writers kind of glossed over what I would consider an interesting relationship between them, especially for that time period, right? Her being a divorcee, and so forth. Secondly, I was hoping that they would further discuss the nullification crisis. They kind of mentioned it briefly with Calhoun, but it seems like I think they're just trying to condense history in such a short time. It kind of got glossed over again. South Carolina, for those of you that don't know, threatened to secede from the Union, and Jackson was actually prepared to go to war to enforce the supremacy of the federal government in this case, which I actually find fascinating, considering, as Jeff had pointed out, he was a populist, right? He was for the people. So John Calhoun, his threat actually helped, I would say, things that are relevant today, like defining states' rights versus federal authority, which we can see in the case of COVID, right, and reopening. Additionally, Jackson had temporarily stopped a possible civil war from breaking out decades earlier, right? So Civil War broke out 1861. Jackson was president in 1820s. So in addition to that, and lastly, I'm a little bit bummed they didn't go further into the bank war, which I think is really fun, and considering the fact that we will be discussing Hamilton soon, who's kind of like the father of the Bank of the United States, right? Funnily enough, Jackson somehow ends up on our currency to this day, although I know that's up for debate and discussion. Jackson was very wary of the bank's power and influence, so he let the charter die in 1836, and as Jeff noted, Van Buren was kind of stuck cleaning it up, and actually the portrayal of Van Buren, I think, is also interesting in the musical, right? When they first meet, and how, Van Buren's kind of like fawning over him and kind of fangirling, if we're talking about rock, that theme. So ultimately, this was not a great choice. It led to economic instability, and due to rising prices and inflation, would ultimately lead into depression, which Van Buren had to handle in his presidency. Once again, I think economic crises might be relatable to contemporary viewers, just due to 2008 and possibly with COVID now. Like I said, while I think they're trying to condense a lot of history in a short period of time, the writers had to choose what they had to highlight. But I would argue that they missed out on some of the interesting points in Jackson's presidency.
Yeah, that's a good assessment of all of those things where they kind of, if they just had an extra 30 minutes added, they probably could have done a lot more with his battles with all of those things that you had mentioned. Well, we're almost out of time. We got about a minute and a half left, but I do want to do an overall critique of a Jackson, which I think Bloody and Andrew Jackson brings a new outlook to Andrew Jackson that can be reminisced to some parts of the politics and the climate that we are seeing now and in the last few years. Do you have an overall comments?
Yeah, I don't think I could say it any more eloquently than you have. I think overall the punk rock emo approach works really well for a rebellious historical figure like Jackson, and hopefully propels viewers into learning more about this very turbulent time period in history, and see if there's, how it compares to today's topics in politics.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of characterizations that people make now, and even Donald Trump has made characteristics to himself and Jackson. So I think that Jackson needs to be brought back to the forefront. But we'll see what the historians think, if they compare Trump to a Jackson or not. We'll find that out in about 20 years when they start to write more about our time period. But that's all the time we have for this podcast. So next time we will go into our third part, which is what we like to call the main thing of Hamilton. So thank you again for being on this podcast, Ms. Sorensen, and we'll hopefully see you next time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.